things for this new, for me, auditorium, because I mostly work with students in sociology, in social anthropology. My husband is an architect, so we have some domestic talks at homes about architecture, its changes and so on, but still for me as for lecturer, this is new auditorium. And I conducted my PhD fieldwork and defended my thesis in 2005 at Lund University in anthropology, and my fieldwork was conducted in Visaginas, which is a town built in 1970s, 1980s in eastern Lithuania, and this is town next to the Ignalina nuclear power plant, and urban aspects, or more to say the ways people, local people perceived their settlement, the town, the buildings, the changes there were quite important dimension in my research. And also, after I defended my thesis, I work in Lithuania as a researcher and as a teacher. And my own research was very much based into the field of so-called anthropology of socialism and post-socialism, which was specific field in anthropology. That is, the researchers, anthropologists were doing fieldwork in societies of East Central Europe during socialism, late socialism, and also in early post-socialism. And I will try to show you and then to discuss with you what anthropology can propose for other disciplines, for other professions, what and how these findings could be interesting for people who do their careers in urban studies, in architecture. And I take from these studies different aspects on everyday life, on solidarities, on consumption, and also keep in mind such issue as when I will introduce shortly what is anthropology. For anthropologists, people are those who are the most important. This is our focus. So we will discuss why it could be interesting for you and what could be kind of important insights for other fields as well. So I switched on my slides. I hope you can see them well.
Not yet.
You cannot see, okay. Once again, it always happens with my computer, this focus Marocus. And now?
Yeah, now it's good.
Good. So I have slides. I know that I have to fit into 1 hour, and I hope you will enjoy this perspective of other discipline, and we can find some kind of meeting points and importance, why it's important for different professions. So I named my talk as Body, Spaces and Control, Intersections of Private and Public in Everyday Lives of People in Societies of East Central Europe during Socialism's Finding of Anthropology. Body, spaces and control are pretty broad categories, which let me to put under them quite much information and anthropological approaches to them, and also this private and public also structured this approach in some way. Also, I didn't mention that in anthropology there is such subfield as urban anthropology. When the people who specialize in urban anthropology, they do anthropological fieldwork in the cities, in towns, but in this presentation, it's a bit different aspect, like there were not numerous research in this region in socialist period, and it didn't focus on specifically on urban things from anthropological perspective. So I will focus on the findings of anthropologists about everyday life in so-called societies of East Central Europe, or socialist societies in Europe in 1970s, 1980s. And the focus is on the ways state-controlled consumption patterns form some solidarity spaces and how this control was negotiated by Soviet citizens. And also, I will talk about transformations during post-socialism, during early post-socialism. All my talk will be based on findings of anthropologists. I will introduce their names, their findings, these aspects that could be interesting for you, for this auditorium, because as you could understand, like when there is so pretty fast change, pretty fast rupture, the things that were before, they are still there in post-socialism, and it's pretty a good period when you can see what was back then and what is transforming. So you cannot just separate these two periods if you want to understand people's lives back then and later. So I will start very quickly, because I cannot start talk without introducing you what is anthropology. I am sorry for those people who already know what is anthropology, but maybe some of you don't know, and I would like to introduce. So what does it mean if I say that I'm an anthropologist? So I wrote for myself these few questions, and I will talk very, very quickly. So when somebody asks what anthropologists do, what anthropologists study, it's a very difficult thing to answer. And even in anthropological textbooks, you would find discussions by anthropologists who say, for example, I think it's, I won't name the names, but that it's sometimes easier to say what anthropologists do not do instead of what we do, because that could be anthropology of food, anthropology of environment, anthropology of urban sites, but we say that we study culture. This is what we often say, that culture is the term which is important for us. Culture cannot be separated from socium, from social aspects. So in a very simple way, we as anthropologists say that we study people's behavior, people's model of behavior, norms, values, and we're interested in different ways of living. We're interested in the lives of, I don't know, farmers, lives of bureaucrats, lives of teachers, and one of the things which we say that makes us different from others is our fieldwork. That means that we do long ethnographic fieldwork. We don't just come and make interviews and leave, but we stay with people. So, for example, if I would like to study the microrayon you are going to study online, I would have to rent a flat there, settle there, and communicate with neighbors, see what is happening there in the morning, in the evening, and collect all this ethnographic material, all this understanding of what does it mean to live there, how people who live there feel about this, how they whether and how they identify with this particular place. So we ask, use the same methods and do the same long-term fieldwork since Bronislaw Malinowski at the beginning of the 20th century, and since him it's the norm that you cannot, as he said, you cannot just hear, you cannot just listen what people say, but you have to live with that. So he put his tent among local people in some islands far away and started his fieldwork. And for us it is important, all these details which you could name trivial details, like where people put their trash, how often they put the trash, how they understand what is to be clean or what is dirt, how they communicate when they meet their neighbor on the floor. And all these small things would be important for us, all these small details. And we're interested in emic perspective, that is what people think on some particular phenomena. Like in anthropology, we do not assume that there is some kind of universal understanding of what it is to be a good neighbor, or what it's to be a dirty place, or what is to be to do some collective practices, we assume that it's always has to be contextualized, and we have to find out people's perspective on this. So what is to be a good neighbor here in Kaunas might differ of what is to be a good neighbor in Stockholm, for example. It may involve close, much longer or much shorter communication or participation in some activities and so on. So we also compare, because it's very important to understand what is specific to some particular place, to some particular sociocultural group. It's important to compare to some similar group case in some other location. So for me, it would be very interesting for us, for anthropologists, if somebody would conduct some similar research like you do in that district in Kaunas, in Eiguliai, and somebody would do the same thing in some chosen district in Warsaw or in Moscow or in some other region. And we also admit to the principle of cultural relativism, which involves that we try not to look through the ethnocentric lenses. We do not come and condemn like these people are too rude or these people are unpolite, but for us, everything is contextualized, and it's no better or worse culture or behavior. Like all these cultures are equal. And when I was preparing for this class, I was thinking, so what could be important or interesting for architects or for urban people who study urban studies? And I came across the book of Ray Lucas, Anthropology for Architects, Social Relations and the Built Environment, Bloomsbury. I'm sure you have much more, even better books and suggestions, but I found this pretty good and pretty interesting, and I'm not going very much into this. But his emphasis in this book, his emphasis in introduction and through the chapters, just to quote Ray Lucas, that space is not only physical or material phenomena, but, and the quotation mark starts, embedded socially and culturally. So he emphasizes that if you study or if you plan to do something about space, inside or outside, you have to think about the social and cultural aspects. And I hope that in this presentation, I will be able to touch upon some of these social and cultural aspects that were found by anthropologists during socialism and early post-socialism that might be interesting for you. And when you will be working with your tasks in this summer school, maybe you will give you some ideas. For example, Ray Lucas in his brilliant chapter 3, which is called Home and What It Means to Dwell, he very nicely unites perspectives of anthropology and architecture, and explains why anthropology might be interesting and important for those people who design homes. And he emphasizes these things, that trivial things, like that the home is also related with our identities, it's expression of our identities, that the home is the place of social interactions. There are places designed by architects which might encourage meetings of the neighbors or discourage, and many other things you could find, which for me as for anthropologists were interesting, and for me it was also like, aha, this is what might be and is also important for people of other professions who work with designing and architecture. So at the beginning, just to locate more specific findings, I have to explain why anthropology and socialism and post-socialism. Because usually when you think about socialism or post-socialism, you might think that there should be historians who conducted their studies, or I don't know, people of finances or politologists, and here you have anthropologists. And anthropologists, from my point of view, and you can find this in the books, they did great work in helping us to understand of what was socialism due to their fieldwork in the field, in the region. Because I would say that now when you study socialism from nowadays perspective, this is my opinion and probably not mine, you can rely on, I don't know, written materials, on some newspapers, on people's memories. And this was specifically anthropologists, a few, not many anthropologists, who managed to conduct fieldwork mainly in Romania, Hungary, and Poland, some in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, in a socialist period, in 70s, 80s. I mean anthropologists who are sociocultural anthropologists, not ethnologists, because there could be some kind of also different understanding on the field. And you can, so I can name such names as Stephen Sampson, Katrin Verdery, Chris Hahn, Humphrey, and also others as well. There's not the case that I should name all of them, but these were the people who, due to some policy of Hungary, of Romania, were able to come, many of them from the US, and conduct fieldwork during socialist period, for example, in the collective farm or in some other location, and with their methods, living with the people and kind of noting all these, what could be seen as trivial details, they can make us understand now what it was the life back then and what was happening in post-socialism. And ethics also very important in anthropology, just to make you understand that those people who did research during socialism, they were also surveyed by local KGB, for example, structures. They were expelled from some countries as personas non gratas, and that's why it was not so easy fieldwork. But when the socialist bloc, socialist period ended, this field opened for, like all this which is in yellow, all these countries I am talking about, this field became open for anthropologists, and the region became very interesting for anthropologists. And in early post-socialism, so in 1990s, when huge transformations were going on in these countries, there were really many young anthropologists and well-known anthropologists who had conducted research in the field, and they were conducted research on numerous themes, like gender hierarchies, gender identities, changing economic practices, consumption, and so on and so on and so on. But what unites them is the focus on people's level. So we are interested in people's identities, people's everyday lives, people's strategies, people's agency, and people's perception of some processes, and also how our identities, our perspectives also change these processes. So anthropologists work on the people, everyday life, and can tell quite much because they are in the field. So here, as I said, I will focus on body, solidarity, spaces, and control, and public and private. In this presentation, I will use it pretty broadly, like by public here, of course, I mean like the sphere of state, the sphere of social, because I relate it with control, and private is the level of individual. And one more aspect, as an anthropology, I have to be very cautious of generalizations. That means that we're very cautious that we cannot generalize some insights to all the region. And there is a huge discussion in anthropology whether there is such region as post-socialism or socialism. Like anthropologists suggest, like Chris Hahn suggests, that there were different socialism in different countries, that you cannot talk about one single socialist system. And the same in post-socialism, different trajectories, which were also defined as anthropologists with their research proved through historical kind of experiences, much deeper in the history, much long into history than socialism. So anthropologists are very cautious. They conduct research in some particular locality and they say, oh, this is specific to this locality, and it's very kind of, we do not very glad about generalization about of findings to very broad spheres, broad social people, numbers of people. But still, I think that there are repetitions in the findings, and there are attempts of anthropology to say something which was characteristic for socialism, which can we refer to. So I will start from the bodies. Bodies, I mean individual bodies, people, and I was thinking that this is a few aspects which I introduce, which might be interesting for you as for people of younger generation who never lived in that system, and also for maybe some of you are from other countries. So a few aspects of people's lives during socialism that could be also interesting for you when you will be working with us, that area in the town with buildings that were built in the Soviet period. You might imagine and think of how people back then were living and using these spaces. So when you think about socialism, then I am pretty sure that whether you are from the local context or from abroad, you are thinking the first image which often comes is the shops and the empty shelves, because there is this kind of finding that there are no goods for consumption in this system, not enough good for consumption in the system. And here I took from the powerful internet a few photos. So this is a photo by Chris Needlehardt at meat store in Warsaw in 1982. Here is the source, so you can imagine this signals how the shops might look back then, and how looked the people bodies and what they were doing there. Here is from it's very wonderful Virtualios Parodos Archiva. You can find visual material on different aspects, including urbanization during Soviet period in online. And here's the shop, I think it's in 50s or 60s, in one of the small towns of Lithuania, where the shelves seem pretty, many things into them, but very, very uniform things. And here you have the photo from the same source, and just what we all knew or heard, it's about lines. People are standing in lines for the goods that are not enough for everybody. And just to maybe provoke you a bit, or make you smile, or make you think a bit, here I took a quote from brilliant book of anthropologist Alena Ledinova, who is the book on blood. This is a phenomenal characteristic for, she works in Russia, but we in Lithuania, as part of the, since we were part of the Soviet Union, we know what this means, blood and networking and informal exchange. So this is, she uses this kind of note from the Soviet period, from, I think this is from her fieldwork material, and it says, food, Lyubov Lazarevna, dry cleaning, Big Luda, toilet paper, Little Luda, concert tickets, Irina Mikhailovna, flowers, Ivan Kirillovich, bottle. Maybe some of you can explain what does it mean, what this puzzle mean. Just a few seconds. The young generation, do you understand what all this puzzle says about? Food, Lyubov Lazarevna. Is she going to eat Lyubov Lazarevna? Or is she going to bring Big Luda for dry cleaning? What does it mean? You are brave young generation. Please say somebody say a few words. Can you decipher me this?
Vaiva, your ideas. No ideas?
Vaiva, you don't know?
I don't speak Russian. That's why I'm trying to say something and trying.
Yeah,
to
but
think
there's no
something, but
Russian. It's
that's-
food, dry cleaning, and Lyubov Lazarevna Bekluda. It's names. It's people's names.
Okay. No idea.
But that's good. That's brilliant. That young generation doesn't know what does it mean. It's an example of what she was talking about the Soviet period and about blood. Like Viva and others whom I don't see because it's just minimal number of videos which I can see. You should talk with your grandparents or your parents. So how they get access to some material things, to goods like food, or I don't know, some cleaning materials, or the materials they needed for housing, furniture, or when you need to, I don't know, to do anything in your house, inside or outside. So this is kind of a list of people whom the owner of this list can approach for some services, like food. As you saw in the picture, the shelves were empty. So if you want to have access to meat or to bananas or to some other food which you might need, you have to contact Lyubov Lazarevna, because maybe Lyubov Lazarevna is in debt to you for something, maybe for, I don't know, some lessons, or maybe you gave her, I don't know, some cucumbers in exchange to other kind of food. And flowers, like you need flowers from Ivan Kirillovich, maybe he has, maybe he works at some, I don't know, in some sector which produce flowers, so you bring him bottle and you get some flowers which you cannot buy in the shop as it is now. So this is the complex kind of system of exchange which is talked by Ledeneva in her brilliant book on blood. And all this networking and all this exchange of services, when, for example, if you need to buy something, you have to know somebody who works on some particular point, and he or she who helps you with some, I don't know, clothing or meat or some concert tickets, might approach you for your services. So this was called in Soviet Union as blood, and it had other kind of names, titles in other spheres of the socialist system. And all this was happening in what Werder, in her brilliant book on what was socialism and what comes next. This is the main anthropological book where she tried to present the main features of socialist state and everyday life in socialist state. She talks about economy of shortages, and the economy of shortages in Werder's book is the situation when there was not adequate planning, so different institutions didn't produce the adequate number of goods, and so people didn't have enough things to consume. And in order to survive in the system, you need to have connections, and blood was one of possibility, this mutual help to survive, to have access to this. For me, there's much more complicated model in her book, but for me, what might be interesting for you also, and when you will be working in that Soviet period district, of course, it has changed much. But for example, Werder interprets the fact that people were staying in the shops for hours to get some simple goods. Or that she refers to Romania when citizens were not sure when they will have electricity at home, at what particular hours, when they have hot water at home. She refers to this as etatization of time, as some kind of control of citizens' time. That you cannot control your day. You don't know when actually you will get stuck at some line, because something is in Lithuania we have išmestas, taken off into the shop where you can buy. And what the different anthropologists in their research, many anthropologists here refer to Berdal, to Nielsen, just to finish with this aspect. Very often we have this image that the Soviet society, socialist society, was egalitarian, that it was homogeneous socially, that people were equal. They had, I don't know, equal access to goods and equal economic possibilities, but different research like Berdal in Eastern Germany, Nielsen in St. Petersburg, and many others, they referred to the fact that there were differences in the ways of what kind of political and social status you have, how much close you are to nomenclatura, those party members, and so on. And if you work at some institution which provides you access to some goods, you have more social connections, so you have more possibilities to use these connections and to consume much more different and of better quality goods. So, for example, Nielsen in his book about Soviet Russia, he refers to oranges, when oranges are not just oranges. If you have oranges, that means that you have access to these oranges, because you cannot find oranges just by entering the shop. And if you are going with jeans, with oranges, if you have some interesting pens to write with at the school, that signals also your status, your social connections, and so on. So the other aspect, which is also interesting when we talk about socialist society, was this symbol of West, which was analyzed by different anthropologists. Here, refer just anthropological research, as I say. I do not go into historian research and sociological or whatever. And anthropologists show how this image, symbol of the West was important in these societies, and also in the way people consume and present their bodies and their identities through consumption on certain goods and certain symbols. For example, Alexei Yurchak, a very famous anthropologist who works in the US, in his book, Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More, he talks about, it's his expression, imaginary West, that people, they couldn't go, they couldn't travel, so they had imaginations about some land somewhere with specific symbols and specific kind of attributes, which they contextualized in Soviet context. So it was something not Western, but specific to the Soviet societies, which is very, very interesting. And in his book, when I was preparing for this lecture, I found, for example, just such interesting notes in his book when he said that, for example, if during Soviet time, he writes about Russia, Soviet Russia, you could enter into cafe and find under very usual name, like, I don't know, vaikystė, childhood, or whatever, people in their everyday talk very often used these Western words and named the street, right? Broad or Broadway, which maybe was Lenin Prospects, but they named it as Broadway, or cafes as Liverpool, Rome. So it was also kind of symbols of the West, which were contextualized, reinterpreted in Soviet culture. And according to Yurchak, it was not kind of persecuted by the authorities or so on. But for example, in Lithuania, I still have to mention this Živilė Tankutonytė in her research on hippies movement in 1970s. She shows how hippies themselves in this context were perceived by authorities related with the West, as symbols of the West, symbols of the freedom, and these people were actually put into psychiatric hospitals, and their lives was very, very damaged just because they identified with this movement. What is also interesting in the way of our inner spaces, identities, and consumption of our homes, also very numerous research of anthropologists refer to the practices of people in this region when through consumption of Western goods in 90s, for example, people were also trying to identify what was called by Fehérváry and in other contexts, a return to normality, return to the Western kind of living. And here in Fehérváry chapter, she talks about Hungarian houses, like inner spaces, flats, when after the breakdown of the Soviet system, socialist system, Hungarians were trying to make the homes as close to what they see in fancy photographs of Western kind of living with expensive kitchens and so on, and explain this to the researcher that as a kind of return to normality, where Hungary belongs to the Western part. So through consumption, you express your identity, and this is also related, as anthropologists show, to the way we live, to the way we kind of arrange our inner places, our houses. And this was process which was going and kind of research described by very, very different researchers, like that it was not just simple action to buy some particular goods, but it was also an expression of your identity. What was also important, what I found interesting, having in mind today's auditory, I was thinking about connection of identity, space, control. So anthropologists, they emphasize, for example, Sarah Ashwin in 1999, she was researching, it also research conducted in Russia in working collective, like industrial collective. She explains very nuanced with many nuances what collective, community. I know that Vaiva and other young generation whom I cannot see because my computer shows just limited number of faces, maybe don't know collective. In Russian it was collective, community, like a group of community, maybe it's the most close thing. So this collective, especially work collective, like where you work at some industrial place like factory or farm, collective farm, ideologically it was emphasized that it's very important that you are part of collective. You cannot be individual, you should be part of collective. And Ashwin, in her interesting study, she shows that for people in that Russian working context where she did her research, for them to be part of collective was very important. It was related with the identity and also with provisions, with social security, that through being part of some bigger group, it was expected by ideologically, but also through being part of this, you have many economic benefits as well. But at the same time, collective was also the means of control, like you have to be as everybody, as part of collective, like hippies, like Tankutonyte shows, different consumption. They were too individual through their consumption with the ideas, and that's how they experience this very, very negative attitude which damaged their lives from the Soviet authorities. So in regards to the spaces, again, inner spaces, those researchers, anthropologists who worked in Russia, they refer to such phenomena as communal apartment or kommunalka. I actually don't know, at least it wasn't much spread in Lithuania. Those architects, urban scholars will correct me if I'm not right, but in anthropological research is usually identified as part of everyday life in Soviet period in Soviet Russia. And Katya Sarayeva, in her very interesting book, Lesbian Life, Sexuality, Space and Subculture in Moscow, she writes about this privacy And she refers to this kommunalka when people had to live a few families in the same space. They had separate rooms, but common, like kitchen, common bathroom. And she refers to this as that the space, of course, that it's created possibility of collective control. You couldn't live very individual, very different lives, because there were neighbors, there were much of spying, much of other things, and in this way, this case, the space influences the way people relate to each other, and also, of course, not just space, but it's also about privacy and control and community. In regards to outside urban places, then this was the photo made by me in Visaginas, not during Soviet period, just a few weeks ago, but it signals photo probably for you what is usually related or identified with socialist period. And I start from Smith, David Smith. In his chapter, he's not anthropologist. I don't know his profession, but it was very interesting for me to read in his chapter, The Socialist City. He's starting from the general question, so was there such phenomena as socialist city at all? And what is characteristic to it? And he doesn't give the answer. He says that if communal living, kommunalka, could be treated as characteristic of socialist city, then it was not spread very widely. And he says that if equality in housing conditions and access to services is a distinctive feature of socialist city, then he says that maybe some people would say that yes, but also others would say that the same aspirations were characteristic to other societies, capitalist society as well. And then he refers to such phenomena as Khrushchev housing program in late 1950s and such phenomena as microrayon, which you know, and where you will, as I understand, you will be working with this. And I just want to address one aspect, which is also supported by anthropological research, is that he says that even the aspiration might be set, or we have this image that this was equality in housing condition and access to services, but he argues about socioeconomic differentiation inside apartment blocks and in urban landscape. And this is related also what anthropologists also talk about, this differences in different groups in socialist society, in the access to services, in the access to goods. There was definitely no equality and no, as we imagine, equal possibilities. Some people might were shopping in special shops, others had to use the shops we saw in the pictures before. So my main argument is about this kind of suggestion that when you will go to that microrayon, as anthropologist, I would ask such question: who is living there now? What kind of, what are the incomes of people there? Are there similar, who is living in which house if there are differences? Who were living there before? What people tell about their lives there, or how they identify. So it's socioeconomic differentiation was clear during socialist period, and now, of course, as well. Then if we talk about spaces and post-socialism, then anthropologists were doing very interesting researches on interesting themes, and in one or another way, the spaces came into their focus. I don't know how you're familiar with Lithuanian context. Just one note, it's about, this is Gariūnai market. This is earlier photo. I took it from TripAdvisor source because I was looking for the photo, which not contemporary, but from earlier times. So I cannot identify which exactly this is the year, but this is the Gariūnai market. So local people know where it is, and Gariūnai market, you was studied by Danish anthropology Hognen Pernille in 2003. Her research was done in 1994, 1995, and she was doing interviews. She was staying in the market from mornings till evening. She was selling the things together with the local people. And why it's important here that her focus in this research on changing society, on social and cultural transformations, on changing identities and changing understandings of what is a proper business, how people should earn their money. Like in this market, many people went from different specialities and started to sell different goods just to make, to earn for their living. But the market was also a kind of site where you could see all these transformations, and also the market itself as a place of new economic practices became visible. And here she talks also about space, and she asks, so why this market was marginalized? Why people who were working there were seen as, or going to shop there, were seen as some kind of uneasy process, that you can be attacked by criminals here. But also she says that spatially, spatially, the market at that time was put in the outskirts of Vilnius. And that's why it's also important, I guess, for you as architects, urban planners. So what you put in the center, what we put in the margins, and how this is related with our identities or with transformations we encounter. One more thing, it's about, we started to talk from microrayon, from these block houses. And what anthropologists document when they document transformations of our identities, of the ways we lived in early post-socialism, since this helps to understand, as I said, as Stephen Sampson said, what was before, is this suddenly people were able to have private property and to build their houses. And these photos were made just 2 days ago in one of the districts, but these houses, I believe, were built in 1990s, especially this one in the left. You can imagine how huge it is with the towers, and this belongs also to this house, and they know that people are trying to sell it, but nobody wants to buy it now because it's a huge house, and this is also some kind of that period not finished. Probably people didn't have enough money to complete it. And Carolyn Humphrey, in her really very interesting book, The Making of Soviet Life, one of the chapters is on these private houses and how they are related with our cultural identities and with changes in our identities and economy. And she tries to read these villas of what she calls New Russians, that this new rich group of people in Russian society, which became rich very fast in early 90s, and who started to build houses, private houses for themselves and for their families. And she relates these material buildings with identities, that it's with social and cultural aspects. And she reads these villas as certain kind of referring to social status of these people, as referring to the idea of property. And she says that these people also experienced pretty negative attitudes from surrounding people who perceive them as not subscribing to Soviet values, as not belonging to collective, and their houses, the big houses, as referring to their kind of different identities. So identities, also changing identities as materialized in these homes, in these villas, which what was happening in post-socialist period. And for me, for example, it also was very interesting here idea about dachas and villas. Dacha in Russian, dacha is the same as in Lithuanian sodo namelis, I would say, dacha. And villas, this new villas. And she kind of reads and says you can understand the change in this property, idea of property and the idea of changing positions, that dachas is from to give, that to give, that if you, somebody, the party, the authorities gave you, they gave you, you are not a real owner. They gave you, it can be taken back. You are not fully free to restructure it. It's controlled how you use it by the state. And villas, according to Humphrey, is already, nobody gave you this. It's due to your wealth, due to your status. So it's also changing society and changing materiality and identities. One more thing, if we think about urban spaces, in urban spaces you have squares, you have monuments, and here anthropologists are especially good in relating identity issues, changes, transformations, and monuments who are sitting in these squares. So here the photo was made in Soviet Sculptures Museum in Grūto Parkas in Lithuania. That is the place, the private museum where all the sculptures, or most of the sculptures that were sitting in the squares of the main cities and smaller cities of Lithuania, and symbolizing that former ideology, former regime like Lenin, Stalin, all the taken to this specific parkas, and you can go and watch and see the sculptures in new context, while earlier they were in the main squares and the main places of the cities. And again, Catherine Verdere, in her book Political Lives of Dead Bodies, she asks us to look at these changes of these statues that were taken off from their postaments and new status put there, of reburial of the bodies. Famous people were brought to all the countries in this block, the historical figures, the people who had to escape from Soviet regimes. They were put back, brought back, if they're dead, they are reburied, new statues put on the postaments. And she relates this with changing identities. And she says that the socialist change, post-socialist change, a quotation, is much bigger. And she says that it's also, in her words, reordering of people's entire world. So it's much bigger, it's related with our identities. And then anthropologists are also interested, so what kind of attitude local people have to this Soviet past, to the Soviet relics? And Francisco Martinez, in his book Remains of the Soviet Past in Estonia, which is you can find online, it's open access. He analyzes, so what happened to the Soviet legacies? And why? This was a quotation. So what is the perception of those buildings in these microrayons, some things, and he uses the notion, he suggests the notion of waste. He talks of them, it's his expression, wasted legacies. And he says that it's also related with our identities, with our experiences, what we perceive as heritage and what we perceive as wasted legacy. And he gives many different examples of from Estonia, from Tallinn, from Narva, where he shows how sometimes the perception of these Soviet places differ, but in any way he uses this general trend as wasted legacies, talks of this, identifies as perception of the Soviet material culture as wasted legacies, including architectural buildings, and also says that generational differences could be a chance since younger generation may have different experiences, different perception, and no such experiences in the Soviet period, and this might be a chance for different perception of this Soviet period material things. So from what is said, what could be important for urbanists, for architectures, what anthropologists try to say. So it's, I think it's what was said by Lucas at the very beginning, that people's identities, culture, the way we use the space, our social relations, these things are interrelated and they have to be taken into account. What anthropologists can say about public and private during socialism, then of course there were a number of aspects when the state was seen as controlling our consumption, the way we present our bodies, the way we can or cannot use some symbols, the way we live, how much privacy we have if we live in these Soviet period buildings or in kommunalkas. But at the same time, what anthropologists try to say, and here I give some reference to Jurčak, to Klumbytė, Šarafudinova, they try to emphasize this agency of people, that they were not only passive, I don't know, individuals, that there was much of agency in consuming, much of agency in dealing with this control, and this has to be taken into account. And just I have 2 minutes, which I would like to complete with my own experience in Visaginas, like a bit of this my own fieldwork. So Visaginas, it's for locals, know those who are from other sides, it's a very interesting place. It's the town built next to the Ignalina nuclear power plant. In the 70s, 80s, most of inhabitants came from different places of the former Soviet Union, and the town was actually built. People who live there now, and then they were coming and building and raising the houses and then the plant. And yeah, this is the picture made by Vasily Chupachenko, one of my informants when I was doing research. He came to Visaginas, to these buildings, and made many, many photographs. He had a huge archive, so it's kind of give you a sense of how this looked back in 70s. And this is how it looked back a decade ago. And when I was my focus of research was completely different, but it was very interesting for me and kind of revealing that people, when they were talking about their current lives back then, they were very much related it with the place. The place itself was related with the nuclear plant, the place where they could, most of them could end the living, but at the same time they were talking about the Visaginas as the most beautiful town, a sign of modernity, as urban place in the nature, nicely composed with nature, friendly to local people. You can reach any site on foot in 15 minutes. It had to be in the form of butterfly. Some of them said that it's the only town where the socialist life was really reached because it was so friendly for local people. And it was very clear that Visaginas is the place they came for, they built it, they identify with this way of living, and the notions they used talking about the town, the streets, was very much the same as they were talking about themselves. Young, progressive, and so on. And later they were talking with as resulting in the commissioning of the plan, they were talking about Visaginas as a place in decline. But the way they described the town, the street, either in progress as they saw it or in decline as they saw it, it seemed very much as if they described their own lives. And that's one more emphasis how people's identity and locality is connected. And as an anthropologist, for me, it's always very important to see how people perceive the places they're living. And here I have to show a few references of publications I referred to, which is really very interesting to find and read. Thank you very much. I am